welcome everyone to the EPA Plus Social Care Gateway Workshop. My name is Craig Miller and I'm one of the Relationship Managers here at EPA Plus at NCSE. And what we're going to be doing today is talking you through the gateway requirements and providing some hints and tips around the social care standards. I'm joined by my colleague Leanne Elliott. Leanne, do you just want to say hello?
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Perfect. So we're going to go through the slides this afternoon, where we're going to go through some general guidance, some general information and tips, and then we're going to look at all of the standard specifics and break down into the different areas, and this is going to be the order of flow for today. So we're going to first take a look at the adult care worker section, moving on to the lead adult care worker, the lead practitioner in adult care, and then the leader in adult care. And then we'll move on to the children, young people, families, practitioner and manager standards as well. And then we will open the floor for questions at the end as well. So feel free to use the questions feature within GoToWebinar, and we'll be happy to pick those up at the end and answer any questions that are asked throughout. If there is any that are asked that we don't get a chance to answer today, we will send a follow-up anyways with the FAQ document, as well as the slides and the recording as well. So we're going to start off by looking at some general guidance. So Leah, thank you. So the first thing we're going to look at is just a quick sort of recap on registrations, really. So apprentices must be registered on SEPA a minimum of 90 days prior to being ready for EPA, which is in line with the ESFA funding rules. And the reason we request that, and the ESFA sort of stipulate that, is just to make sure that your endpoint assessment organisations themselves are aware of your apprentices entering into their EPA, so we can forecast capacity and potentially recruit if needed and allocate resource to those apprentices at that time. If EPA is requested without being registered for 90 days, we can't guarantee acceptance through to endpoint assessment. And that is just for the purpose that if we haven't had that notice, we might not have been able to forecast them into capacity, and we might not have capacity currently available. However, if we do have capacity, we will accept those apprentices through to endpoint assessment. But it is important that you complete any registrations as soon as possible. We don't have any registration or withdrawal fees pre-gateway, so there is no sort of financial implications to your registering apprentices at the beginning of their apprenticeship journey. We do recommend that you register your apprentices after the non-qualifying period, so after that period where they can withdraw without sort of affecting any statistics. We do ask that when you register your apprentices, you ensure that the registration takes place on the correct standard or pathway, and that all the details match those within the ILR. And that's just to prevent any issues with claiming of certificates at the end and making sure that contact can take place with the apprentices. We also ask that you ensure that the contact details for the apprentices are entered correctly and kept up to date, because especially if you do registrations at the start of the apprenticeship, chances that an apprentice might change an employer or change a mobile number or email address go up the longer they're registered on that platform. So we do ask to make sure that they are kept up to date just for that contact purpose. We do have a video guide on registering apprentices, which can be found on the link. And as I've mentioned, you will get a copy of the slides following the webinar. So you'll be able to click on that link to access that. So we're going to move on and have a little look at the functional skills requirements. And it is an ESFA requirement that the apprentices complete functional skills as part of their apprenticeship. And an apprentice completing a level 2 apprenticeship must achieve a minimum of level 1 functional skills, maths and English, and an apprentice completing a level 3 apprenticeship must achieve a minimum of level 2 functional skills, maths and English. Usually in sort of non-COVID circumstances, apprentices at a level 2 apprenticeship must also attempt level 2, and that's all elements of the level 2 functional skills. However, there is the dispensation around that at the moment, and that's being extended until the 31st of July this year. So the apprentices don't need to attempt those functional skills if they are going to enter endpoint assessment before the 31st of July. There are some assessment plans that do stipulate that an apprentice must also achieve ICT. However, there's none of these standards currently do so. However, they are introducing that. The Institute for Apprenticeship are introducing that requirement into various standards. And as other standards do get updated and reviewed, that may be added in. So it's always worth keeping an eye on that. We can accept evidence of equivalent qualifications, such as GCSEs or key skills, among various other sort of qualifications out there. And a full list of the ESFA approved qualifications can be found on the link that's on this slide, which takes you to the government website, the ESFA website, where you can download a spreadsheet that shows what is and isn't acceptable. Where apprentices' names don't match the certificate, we must be provided with evidence of the name change, which is obviously where they may have been married or divorced or had changed their name via deed poll. So you must make sure that we are presented with that evidence of name change as well. We are able to accept a variety of types of evidence, which could include a certificate or a statement of results by the awarding organisation or the prior learning records, the PLR reports. We are able to accept those as evidence of achievement at functional skills. What we do request where PLR reports are used, especially where there's a lot of qualifications on those, is the qualifications you want to use as an exemption are highlighted or circled or ticked, just to show that that is the qualification you want to use, just because it can be confusing looking at those, the PLR reports when they've got a lot of detail included. Where you do use international qualifications as exemptions, they must be supported by the NARIC statement of comparability, and they're provided by NARIC themselves. So you would get sent across a copy of the certificate to them, and they would send back a statement of comparability to say whether that was or wasn't acceptable as a sort of equivalent, to GCSEs and functional skills. If an apprentice does have an education, health and care plan or a learning disability assessment or special education need, then they may be able to only need to achieve entry level 3 functional skills and work towards level 1 functional skills, regardless of the level of apprenticeship that they're doing. But more information on that can be found in the ESFA funding rules, because that is an ESFA funding requirement. It's not a stipulation set by yourself, so please refer to the funding rules for that. We're just going to provide a little bit of an oversight as well on presenting evidence, which is around the naming conventions of evidence, recordings, zip folders. So EPA portfolios should be presented in a way that's easy to understand and navigate. So it does include the naming conventions of evidence. So where evidence doesn't clearly map to the evidence tracker where it's suitable, it can cause difficulty in understanding the portfolio and navigating that portfolio. So we do recommend document titles are reflective as to what they are, and that they include the reference on the evidence tracker, such as EO1 for Employer Observation 1, for example. So they should be titled in a sort of a clear way that highlights what that document is and also what that maps to on the evidence tracker. Obviously, not all standards do require an evidence tracker, such as the adult care worker and the lead adult care worker, but still use sort of clear titles as to what they are. Once you've cleared all of the evidence for the portfolio, we do recommend that you add this to one folder and then zip that folder ready to upload to the checklist or the documents tab wherever it requests that be uploaded. We have included a short guide on how to zip a folder as well, which is just done through Google, a quick Google search. But there's lots of different video tutorials, screenshot tutorials on how to do those. And then from the 1st of June, in regards to recorded evidence, we will no longer be accepting portfolios that include individual recordings that are over 20 minutes. And the portfolio must only include up to 1 hour worth of recordings in total duration. So where discussions may have been used due to an apprentice's learning needs and styles, you are able to request a special consideration for those if it's based upon the learning needs of that apprentice. And we will consider those special considerations on an individual basis. The final thing I'm going to talk you through before I hand over to Leanne for a bit is just around gateway audit. Okay, so once you've submitted an apprentice to gateway audit, I just wanted to talk you through that process a little bit. So once you've submitted that request, the gateway audit team get a notification to let them know that that request has been submitted and that we need to conduct that audit. The Gateway Audit team then review the request and check the evidence presented just to make sure that everything is there that's needed, which we're going to provide more detail on through the standards today. You'll receive an outcome of the audit within 4 working days of that request being submitted. And if the apprentice is accepted, an independent endpoint assessor will be allocated and they will make contact within 4 working days of that notification to start arranging the dates of assessments from there. If the request is not accepted at the time, again, you'll receive an email still, and that will inform you of the issues found when the audit has been undertaken. So if there's wrong functional skills evidence there, for example, or you're missing certain pieces of evidence out of the portfolio. We are also going to provide today some common reasons for rejections across all of the standards to provide you with some insight as to common issues that we do find at the audit phase. We do ask that when a request of endpoint assessment is rejected or not accepted, then any evidence that you do have to update that's already uploaded is removed from SEPA before requesting EPA again, just to prevent any duplicated evidence. And then once the feedback has been actioned, you'll be required to request endpoint assessment again for that apprentice, who will then start the audit process again and go through that journey. So I'm going to hand you over to Leanne now for a bit, and she's going to start talking you through some of the care standards and the requirements across this. So I'll speak to you all shortly. Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you, Craig. So we're going to start with the Adult Care Worker EPA request journey. So we're just going to take you through the journey. So as Craig mentioned, apprentices need to be registered at least 90 days prior to their EPA start date, expected on SEPA. And then within the 3 months leading up to endpoint assessment, apprentices will need to gather their service user testimonies in that 3-month period. And then within 1 month of Gateway, they would need to gather their self-assessment, leading them up to endpoint assessment. Now, once all of their evidence is gathered, you will then need to complete the Gateway declaration. And then once completed, upload the evidence and complete the checklist on SEPA to request endpoint assessment. As Craig mentioned, the Gateway Audit team will then conduct the Gateway audit on all of the evidence presented, and once accepted, the apprentice will then enter endpoint assessment and an endpoint assessor will be allocated. Now at this point, apprentices will then gain access to the FICA app, and their assessment dates will then be arranged with the endpoint assessor. So FICA, if you've not seen any of our recent communications, is an innovative mental health support app, which NCFE will be providing for apprentices to access once they successfully enter endpoint assessment with NCFE. Now, apprentices will be set tasks within FICA to support them with their mental health. As we all know, over the last 12 months, apprentices have, may or, a lot of people have been struggling with challenges due to COVID. So this is to help them and support them to prepare for endpoint assessment. So the Gateway requirements for the Adult Care Worker Level 2 apprenticeship is that apprentices need to achieve Functional Skills Level 1 in Maths and English. They need to provide evidence of attempt for Functional Skills Level 2 in Maths and English, all components. Now, as Craig mentioned, there currently is a dispensation in place for evidence of attempt for functional skills. So that's currently in place until the 31st of July. So that's no longer, you do not need to present that at the moment. The EPA Plus Gateway Declaration Form, the Certificate for Level 2 in Diploma in Care, the Care Certificate, and the self-assessment undertaken in the last month of their apprenticeship, and the 2 service user testimonies signed and dated within the last 3 months. Again, the External Quality Assurer has put a dispensation in place, and they're no longer required at the moment, and that's in place until the 31st of July. So we're going to be talking around the mandatory and recommended evidence that needs to be presented for adult care apprentices. So the self-assessment. So as stated in the assessment plan, it's mandatory that apprentices present one self-assessment dated within 1 month of the Gateway date. Now, EPA Plus, we recommend that apprentices include between 4 and 6 self-assessments, one to be dated in with the last month leading up to endpoint assessment, and the remaining within 3 months of gateway date. Now, the reason why we ask for between 4 to 6 self-assessments to be included, as it gives the apprentice ample opportunity to showcase their competency against the knowledge, skills and behaviours set out within the assessment plan. Now, the service user testimonies, within the assessment plan, it's stated that apprentices need to include 2 service user testimonies, again, signed and dated within the last 3 months. Now, at the moment, there's a COVID dispensation in place for that, so it's not required. And that's in place until the 31st of July. And then employer statements. Now, although this isn't a mandatory requirement within the assessment plan, we do recommend that 4 to 6 employer statements supporting self-assessments dated within 3 months of gateway should be included within the evidence to showcase the apprentices and kind of strengthen their knowledge, skills and behaviours through the self-assessments that they have provided. Again, it's not mandatory, but NCSE as an endpoint assessment organisation do recommend they're included. Now I'm going to take you through the common reasons for rejection for the adult care worker. So what we tend to find is the self-assessment has not been completed within the month leading up to endpoint assessment being requested. So what we will do is, at the point of conducting the gateway audit, we'll then review the apprentice's evidence, and if that is not dated, or if that date isn't within the last month leading up to gateway, unfortunately we would then refer that apprentice back to you to review. In non-COVID circumstances, we normally identify that the missing service user testimonies or statement from the employer around why they couldn't be obtained isn't included. So, for example, in non-COVID situations where service user testimonies can't be obtained, we do ask for a statement from the employer to verify why they could not be obtained. So, for example, depending on the setting the apprentice works within, it may not be viable. The service users may be not able to provide those, or they may not have family or guardians who can provide that service user testimony. We also see that the missing evidence of achievement for the care certificate, that sometimes is missing. So that would then result in us having to reject the apprentice. And then no evidence of attempting level 2 functional skills or missing components. And again, that's out of COVID circumstances. So now I'm going to take you through lead adult care worker endpoint assessment request journey. So again, apprentices need to be registered on the system 90 days before gateway. You'll need to be gathering the service user testimonies within the 3 months leading up to endpoint assessment. And then within a month of endpoint assessment, gathering the self-assessment, which needs to be dated within a month. You would then complete the gateway declaration and upload the evidence and complete the CEPA checklist. At that point, you'd then request endpoint assessment, and then one of our audit team would conduct an audit on the evidence being presented. And once everything is there, we'd then accept the apprentice through gateway, and then the apprentice would then gain access to the FICA app and the assessment dates arranged with the endpoint assessor. Now, in terms of the gateway requirements for the lead adult care worker, so apprentices need to have achieved their functional skills level 2 in maths and English, their gateway declaration form, the certificate for level 3 diploma in care, their care certificate, and their self-assessment undertaken in the last month of their apprenticeship, and then the 2 service user testimonies signed and dated within the last 3 months. Again, there's a COVID-19 adaptation in place in there, so that's currently suspended until the 31st of July. So I'm going to take you through the mandatory and recommended evidence to present at gateway. So with the self-assessment, the assessment plan states that 1 self-assessment dated within a month needs to be presented. However, EPA Plus, we recommend between 4 to 6 self-assessments, 1 dated within 1 month of gateway and the remaining within 3 months of the gateway date. Service user testimonies. So within the assessment plan, it states that apprentices need to present 2 service user testimonies signed and dated within the last 3 months. As I mentioned at the moment, the COVID dispensation is currently in place, so that's not required until the 31st of July. And then with employer statements. Now, although these aren't mandatory set out within the assessment plan, EPA Plus, we do recommend that apprentices obtain 4 to 6 employer statements which support the self-assessment dated within 3 months of the gateway date. And again, that's just to support with showing currency and competency on the apprentice's behalf. So common reasons for rejection. So we find that the self-assessment hasn't been completed within a month leading up to endpoint assessment being requested. Again, the missing service user testimonies or statements from employer around why they can't be obtained. Again, at the moment, that isn't a requirement due to the COVID dispensation. And then missing evidence of achievement for the care certificate. So that could be the certificate that you can download from the internet, which is signed by a practitioner to show competency that the apprentice is competent in the 15 areas outlined within the care certificate, or it could be a statement from the employer on letter-headed paper where the actual certificate can't be presented. If you do have any queries or questions around that, please just feel free to contact the relationship team and we'll be able to support and advise. So now we're going to go into the lead practitioner in adult care, which is the level 4 standard. Now this standard was approved back in February 2020, so we haven't actually taken any apprentices through Gateway for this standard yet, so we won't be able to share common practices for rejections, but we can take you through the Gateway process and the assessment component requirements. So again, apprentices need to be registered on the system 90 days prior to being EPA being requested. So the apprentice will be collating the Gateway requirements, they'll be completing the Gateway declaration form, and then their evidence and declaration form will need to be uploaded to EPA and the checklist completed. You'll then request endpoint assessment and one of the audit team will conduct the Gateway audit. Once everything is present, the apprentice will then be accepted. And this is where the apprentices will prepare their activity brief to present to the endpoint assessor. As they're working on that, the apprentice will gain access to the EPA app and the assessment dates arranged by the endpoint assessor. Now, the activity brief, it isn't part of the Gateway requirements to present at the point of requesting endpoint assessment. Apprentices will need to start that brief once they have entered endpoint assessment, and that will need to be sent through to the endpoint assessor 7 working days prior to their assessment date. So the Gateway requirements, so apprentices need to have achieved their functional skills in maths and English. They'll need to have an EPA Plus Gateway declaration form signed, their certificate for level 4 diploma in adult care, their portfolio of evidence, and the EPA Plus evidence tracker. Now, we do ask that you do use our evidence tracker for the portfolio, which can be found on the resources platform. Now, in terms of the portfolio of evidence requirements for the lead practitioner in adult care, so the portfolio of evidence should cover the knowledge, skills and behaviours associated with a professional discussion and contain a minimum of 6 pieces of evidence and must not exceed more than 10 pieces of evidence as set out within the assessment plan. So this evidence should provide holistic examples of how they've met the relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours and applied these to their work in practice. Now, the portfolio of evidence can't include reflective accounts or self-evaluation. And the employer must sign a declaration to confirm that the portfolio is authentic and is the apprentice's own work. Now, EPA Plus, we recommend gathering a detailed piece of evidence for each of the 6 themes to be assessed in the professional discussion. So tasks and responsibilities, dignity and human rights, communication, safeguarding, health and well-being, and professional development. This would then allow the apprentice then to have further 4 pieces of evidence to demonstrate further competencies in the areas if required. So it's important to ensure all evidence produced as part of the portfolio maps to the KSCs of the assessment, which can be found in our specification and guidance document from page 24, which you'll be able to find on the resources platform. Now, if you have any challenges accessing the resources platform, please do contact the relationship team and we'll be able to support with your access. So now we're going to go into Leader in Adult Care Level 5 Endpoint Assessment Request Journey. So as I mentioned, similar to the Level 4, this standard was approved back in February 2020 and we haven't taken any apprentices through Gateway yet. So what we ask is that the apprentices again registered 90 days prior to Endpoint Assessment start date. You'll collate the Gateway requirements, complete the Gateway declaration, and then upload the evidence and complete the seeker checklist and request endpoint assessment. Once endpoint assessment has been requested, one of the Gateway audit team will conduct the Gateway audit, and once everything is present, they'll then enter the apprentice into endpoint assessment. And at this point, this is where the apprentice will then prepare their activity brief and present that to the endpoint assessor 7 working days prior to their assessment. Again, the apprentices will gain access to the Seeker app and the assessment dates will be arranged with the endpoint assessor. So the Gateway requirements for the Lead Adult Care Worker Level 5 is that apprentices need to have achieved their Functional Skills Level 2 in Maths and English, their Gateway Declaration form, and their Level 5 Diploma in Leadership and Management for Adult Care. Now, there isn't any portfolio requirements for the Level 5, so the apprentice does not have to present a portfolio. That, in terms of the Gateway audit process, is quite a slick process. Okay, so now I'm going to pass back to my colleague Craig, who's going to take you through the Children, Young People and Families Practitioner and Manager.
Thank you, Leanne. So as Leanne mentioned, we're going to look at the Children, Young People and Families standards now. And then we'll move through to the Q&A and things like that as well. So we're going to have a look at the Children, Young People, Families Practitioner standard first. And again, as you can see, it's similar requirements as to what Leanne's already discussed on some of the other standards, where your apprentices must be registered 90 days prior to their endpoint assessment date. You need to collate the Gateway requirements. You would then complete the Gateway declaration form, upload that evidence and complete the CBAT checklist. Following that with the request of endpoint assessment, the apprentice would then move to the Gateway audit, enter their endpoint assessment, and then gain access to the Seeker app and arrange the assessment dates from there. So in regards to the Gateway requirements for the Level 4 Children, Young People and Families Practitioner, the apprentices must have achieved Functional Skills Level 2 in Maths and English. They must have the EPA Plus Gateway Declaration form. They must have their Level 3 Diploma for Residential Childcare for the Option 1 pathway, or the Level 4 Certificate in Higher Education in Working with Children, Young People and Families for the Option 2 pathway. They must also have a current DBS certificate, which is valid at the time of EPA. And for that, we don't necessarily need to see the full actual DBS certificate. What we do require is their DBS number so that we can verify that that is valid at that time. You must also include the EPA Plus evidence tracker within that portfolio, within that evidence, and also their portfolio of evidence, which again must include an employer declaration of authenticity. We are going to have a look at some of the sort of tips around these evidence as well. Then you would also need to include the initial brief, which is a 2,000-word document, which is plus or minus 10%, that must be signed and dated by the apprentice. And what that document is its initial brief of the plan for their observation. So it's what activity they plan to undertake as part of their EPA and what they plan to demonstrate to that independent assessor conducting the assessment. So some tips for Gateway evidence is that, obviously, like I just said, the apprentices will produce that brief of their planned observation. And that's there to present to the independent assessor and it should be 2,000 words plus or minus 10%, and should outline what those activities are that they're going to undertake whilst being observed. The importance of that is just to ensure that the independent assessor is aware of what they are, but it also allows the apprentice to sort of plan their observation in line with the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are being assessed within that assessment method. In regards to the portfolio itself, the portfolio must include a minimum of 3 observations of practice and a maximum of 5. They can be conducted by anyone who is competent to conduct those observations, such as the manager or their training provider or their employer. They've just got to be in a position of competence for that standard. The portfolio could include, and it is recommended to include, 3 or 4 specific cases the apprentice has dealt with that demonstrate evidence of assessment, planning, implementation and review. And that's important because those are 4 key areas of the standard. So it is important that those 4 areas are covered within that portfolio. And that's why we say about including those 3 or 4 specific cases that the apprentice has dealt with in regards to those areas. Those cases may look at multiple areas or just one of those areas. There's no sort of requirement around that. So you might have one that looks at both the assessment and planning, and then there might be another case that looks at the implementation and review of that activity or that care that's being provided. We do recommend including the CPD log as part of the portfolio, where the apprentice highlights any key training that they've received, including detail about what they learned within that training, and also how they would implement that into their work and practice, or how they do currently implement that into their work and practice. And that provides a really strong piece of evidence for that portfolio. Again, it's important to ensure that all the evidence produced as part of the portfolio maps to the relevant KSBs of the standard, the knowledge, skills and behaviours for that assessment method. And again, you can find those in the specification and guidance documents from page 22 of that one. And that highlights what the requirements are for that assessment method, and also provides grading descriptors for that assessment, so you can see what the assessment decisions are made against in regards to the criteria that are being marked. So some of the common reasons for rejections on the Children, Young People, Families Practitioner standard is that the portfolio does not include the minimum of 3 or maximum of 5 observations. So it might just include 1 observation, for example, or it may include 6. And obviously the assessment plan does stipulate a minimum of 3, maximum of 5, and that is what we have to go with as to maintain compliance with that assessment plan. So we must ensure that that is being met. The portfolio is over the maximum 25 pieces of evidence. So the portfolio should be no longer than 25 pieces of evidence in total, or must be no longer than 25 pieces of evidence in total. And if that is over that required amount of evidence, then that will cause a rejection, and it will get pushed back just to review, to sort of review the evidence that is included in that standard. And then the other one is that we haven't been provided with any evidence for the DBS. Like I say, all we do need for that is just the number. So that could be the DBS number and the apprentice's name typed into a Word document, for example, and then uploaded to CEPA. And that just gives us the information that we need to conduct that check. So we're going to move on to the Children, Young People, Families Manager standard. And again, you can see the EPA request journey here, which is exactly the same as the Children, Young People, Families Practitioner and the other standards. So I'm not going to go through that in detail with you again, but it is there just for reference when you do receive the slides. The gateway requirements for the Children, Young People, Families Manager is that you must have the functional skills level 2 in maths and English. There must again be the EPA Plus gateway declaration form. The apprentice must have achieved the level 5 diploma in leadership and management for residential childcare for option 1 or pathway 1, or the level 5 diploma in leadership for health and social care, which is the mandatory qualification for pathway 2. We must also be provided with evidence of the current DBS certificate again, which again does not need to be the certificate itself. we do just request that you include a Word document with the DBS number and the apprentice's name included. There is also the EPA Plus evidence tracker, and again, a portfolio of evidence which must include the employer declaration of authenticity. That portfolio of evidence must be no more than 25 pieces of evidence again, and that is a maximum sort of amount of evidence to be included. So in regards to some tips for gateway evidence on this standard, again, the portfolio must include a minimum of 3 observations of practice or a maximum of 5. They can be conducted by anyone who is competent to do so, such as the manager, employer or training provider again. So we've just got to be competent in that area in order to conduct those assessments. The portfolio could include 4 or 5 cases where apprentices managed complexity. So what we mean by that is the cases must demonstrate evidence of assessment of the situation, analysis, decision making, response and review. In regards to those specific cases, the individual cases again might look at multiple areas, but may just be focused on one area. And they could be demonstrated through a variety of different pieces of evidence. The same with the Children, Young People, Families Practitioner. There's a multitude of evidence that you could use as those cases. And they could include things like what's on the screen, such as case notes, action plans, supervision records, case reviews or reports, or records produced as part of the work activities of the apprentice. So that might be carrying out a review of someone's care needs. That is sort of a complex situation where they're having to make decisions that there isn't necessarily a full procedure in place for. So they're having to go sort of on their own back really and make a decision sort of based on their judgment. Again, we do recommend including a CPD log as part of the portfolio because they can be really strong pieces of evidence. And again, it should highlight the key training that they've received throughout the apprenticeship journey and include the detail about what they learned throughout that journey and how they would implement that into their working practice. And again, it's important to ensure that all evidence produced as part of this portfolio map to the relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours of the assessment, which can be found in the dispensation guidance for the Children, Young People, Families Manager document from page 2. So just on that note, there is obviously a dispensation in play at the moment around the Children, Young People, Families Manager standard, which is sort of replacing the assessment methods that were previously announced as part of the assessment plan. So there is that dispensation in order to continue apprentices through to endpoint assessment. And we are currently only assessing against option 1, pathway 1 of that assessment plan, and the dispensations with option 2 being available in June this year for apprentices to start entering their endpoint assessment for. We have had some apprentices start entering EP on this standard since the dispensation was announced. And so we've gathered some of the common reasons for rejections around those portfolios and those sort of apprentices as well. So the first one is that, again, the portfolio doesn't include the minimum of 3 or maximum of 5 observations. The portfolio is over the maximum of 25 pieces of evidence. And again, there's no DBS evidence being provided. And you will see that they are very much the same as the level 4. And it's just because the requirements are very similar between the two standards. And those are sort of the main reasons for rejection across these standards for that. So we're going to have a look at what's next. All right, so what's coming up, what's next available. And so we are planning to host standard-specific workshops where we'll go into detail around the assessment methods in the APA for each of the standards and provide hints and tips around those assessment methods as well. And provide general support around the APA. So we'll provide further information around the date schedule for these by the end of April. So we're just finalising the dates and things like that for those. And we'll provide further information around those and the content of those by the end of April. and please ensure that you're regularly downloading the latest versions of guidance materials from the platform. So we do provide updates within our monthly newsletters and some within our new weekly roundups as well. But to save any missed information, we do encourage downloading the guidance materials from the resource library when they are needed, rather than storing them on your computer, just so that you've always got the latest versions of those guidance materials. We also say to familiarise yourself with the gateway requirements and the tips for each standard to ensure first-time acceptance through to endpoint assessment for apprentices. So obviously what we've gone through today is the gateway requirements for all of the standards and provided some information around those and some tips around those, and looked at some of the sort of portfolio requirements and discussed those as well. So it's just important to familiarise yourself with those, make sure that you're aware, pass that information on to colleagues and apprentices, just to make sure that sort of apprentices can enter their endpoint assessment on that first request of EPA, and then it saves having to go back for further information. So on the next slide, what we're going to discuss is we've provided you with some different useful links available within this slide. So you may have seen these previously in other support sessions that we've hosted, but there is a host of sort of useful links here available to you. Some of these have been included throughout the slides as well, but we have included them at the end just as a separate sort of guide for you. The main ones that I will point out here for you is things like the Institute for Apprenticeships, where you can access the standards and the assessment plans, which is obviously where you can find out the knowledge, skills and behaviours of that standard, and also be more information around the assessment plans themselves. There's also a link for the functional skills exemptions, which I did discuss right at the start of the webinar, but we have repeated that link in the useful links section, just so it's all in one place for you. There's then also the solution briefs and prices. So the solution brief is sort of an overview with basic bite-sized information of the standard, which breaks down the assessment methods in there, and it can be useful to share with the apprentices and employers to help understand the apprenticeship and the EPA. They can be really useful in that sort of IAG phase, the information, advice and guidance phase at the start of the apprenticeship. So use those as sort of to your advantage, really, to help break down the assessment. We've then linked the ACFA funding rules, which obviously everyone would be aware of what they are, but we'll have provided a link to those just so you can get the most up-to-date version of them. There is also the YouTube channel, where we do have previously recorded webinars. We do have various support videos around using the EPA platforms, around accessing resources, hints and tips around things. So that's constantly being updated as well. So keep an eye out on there, because there may be things on there that would be useful for you. You've then got a link to the EPA Plus policies, where you can find all the mandatory policies within the web page, and they're also stored within our resources library as well. And they cover a wide range of things, from the conduct of endpoint assessment through to fees and charges, inquiries and appeals, a whole host of all of the policies that are relevant for endpoint assessment. You've then got the EPA standard timeline, which just shows what plans we have in place for the future, what our product development team are currently planning to develop for the standards that we are going for acceptance for, or have recently gained approval as an EPA for as well. We've then provided you with the links to the Smart EPA or EPA platform, where you register your apprentices, and also the resources library as well, where you can access all of the guidance materials and the specification and guidance documents that we've discussed throughout today's webinar. The final thing, as mentioned, is we are going to be hosting those standard-specific webinars where we're going to EPA sort of in more detail. So please keep an eye out for those communications, because they will be really beneficial, where we'll go through the actual requirements of endpoint assessment, the endpoint assessment methods themselves, and provide you with sort of an in-detail account as to those. Provide you with some hints and tips from our delivery team as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, and listening to myself and Leanne throughout this afternoon. Hopefully you've all found this useful. But if you do have any questions, feel free to use the questions facility and we'll be happy to answer any that you do have. I can see that there's been a couple asked throughout, so we will quickly take those queries, and then if there's anyone else, feel free to use that text box and we'll be happy to answer any that you may have throughout.
So we had a question around adult care and lead adult care worker and the evidence trackers. Now, for adult care and lead adult care worker, we don't require the evidence tracker being completed. This may change in the future, however, it's not currently not mandatory to upload to the apprentice's profile.
And there's only one other question so far, which is again around the service user testimonies. If I'm being used, and it's just saying, can electronic service user testimonies be used, or does it have to be the paper-based template? So you can use electronic testimonies, that's not a problem. All we would say there is just to ensure that it's completed by the relevant person, that service user or a family member. That's not a problem to use electronic versions of those. You don't have to use our templates for them, no. And that is all the questions we've been asked so far. Feel free to use the questions feature within GoToWebinar if there are any further questions. If there's anything we haven't covered in today's session that you would like to ask, feel free. It's an open forum, so please ask any questions that you may have. We'll just leave the webinar open for another sort of 5 minutes or so, just to allow questions to come in, if anyone does have any. If not, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you've all having a lovely Monday, and take care, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining, everyone. I hope you found today useful. As Craig mentioned, we will be sending a follow-up email with the slides and recording, as well as the answers to the questions.
Apologies, I have just remembered, we did set up a poll at the start, so we're just going to quickly launch the poll as well. All it is it's just around how useful you found the webinar today. So what we've done is rated it on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being sort of not useful at all, 5 being very useful. If you feel like we haven't really covered anything that you didn't already know, please feel free to rate it at a 1, just because that allows us to sort of see that we haven't covered sort of in-depth information. But if you have found it useful, feel free to complete the poll that's just on screen now.
Thank you to everyone who has completed the poll. We're now going to close the webinar, so I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today.